Okay, hi, my name is Christine Ellis. I'm a veterinarian with an MPH. I currently work in veterinary services, but until very recently, I worked at the National Wildlife Research Center in both the Rabies Project and with Kurt Burkhardt and Sparrow Swine Group. I'd like to thank the Wild Pig Conference for inviting me to give this presentation, introducing the concepts of applying risk assessments and field biosafety to planning and implementing field work with wild pigs. So I thought I'd start out first by talking a little bit about what biosafety is, or what we perceive it to be. Typically, when we hear that word, this is the definition that first comes to mind. And what we immediately think of is a defined laboratory space with this kind of equipment in it, and this is the range of personal protective equipment, or PPE, that we might need to wear while we're working in that lab with whatever dangerous organism that needs to be worked with. What happens if this is our laboratory and these are our organisms, and maybe our organisms have organisms? When you look at it like this, you can see that biosafety isn't just something that should stay in a laboratory. But that doesn't mean that laboratory-type biosafety can just be plopped into a fieldwork situation. While there are some similarities between the two, there are also a lot of differences that don't allow that to happen. Some of the differences are easy to see. Traditional labs are enclosed, they have nice fancy fixed equipment, and you have the luxury of working on one thing at a time at a nice measured pace. In the field, as we all know, that lab space is often not defined, our equipment is mobile, we're often working in groups at a fast pace, and we're multitasking, and we sometimes don't know everything about our organism or our organisms, and things can change quickly. These differences can be sticking points when it comes to moving the concept of biosafety to the field and developing the safety measures and protocols that go along with the field work. And I've been on both sides of this. So sticking point number one is people who are officially trained in biosafety, from the IPUT committee, the biosafety committee, the safety committee, and occupational health, and on down, often lack field experience, so they don't have a full understanding of what field work is like. Sticking point number two, the reverse is true. Many of the folks that work in the field have not been formally trained in biosafety concepts. They do, however, understand safety, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Sticking point number three, standard laboratory or institutional biosafety practices, SOPs, and PPE do not seamlessly cross over to the field for many of the reasons I already mentioned. It's a shades of gray endeavor, so there has to be some flexibility available, which is what tends to give the people in sticking point number one the willies. Prime examples are the animals we work with who refuse to read our protocols, Mother Nature, and the entrenched idea sometimes of what PPE is and is not. So let me tell you what PPE is from, my perspective. Field personal protective equipment is clothing that is appropriate to the work you do that will keep you safe from exposure to bad things and the environment. Now, there might be times when it's absolutely necessary for you to go to the field dressed like the guys in the upper right-hand photo, but maybe not always. And maybe not everybody on the field crew needs to be dressed like this, depending on what they're doing. Those guys are working on a tularemia outbreak that killed a bunch of people in the area that the outbreak happened, so they really need to be safe. But if they had a guy flying a helicopter over the top of it, would it be necessary for the pilot to dress like this? Would it be safe for the pilot to dress like that? And the answer to that would be no. So it's whatever clothing you need to do the job that you're doing in the field that is going to keep you safe. So just as PPE translates into appropriate clothing to keep you safe, when you are thinking about field biosafety, think about it as safety. You're maintaining conditions in the field to prevent harm to you and your coworkers, the animals you're working on, and the environment that you're in. It's doing what it takes using the tools that are appropriate to the job to achieve those things. So what's a risk assessment and how does it fit into doing field work? A risk assessment is a systematic process of identifying potential risks and hazards associated with doing something, in this case, field work. Now, there's a zillion different algorithms for doing risk assessments, and this is a simple one you can use when you're planning your field work. First, you identify the hazards associated with what you were doing, as many as you can think of. Then you examine how you and your coworkers might be exposed to those hazards. Then you determine the probability that those hazards might occur and what the consequences are going to be if those hazards happen. Then you develop methods to address all of the above. A lot of people hate doing risk assessments, and they hate the concept of risk assessments because they see this as kind of a negative Nancy thing, but it's actually a realistic Rita thing. Because something is and always is going to go wrong with any study, whether it's in the lab or in the field. And it's better to try to think of those things and think of ways to prevent or address those things when they are going to happen in the field than to have some kind of an accident happen in the field that upon review is going to be identified as something that could have been preventable. And you certainly don't want to have something happen in the field that's going to result in a severe injury to a person. So here's an example of how I would start a risk assessment for a field study that's going to involve trapping and collaring wild pigs. What are the immediate hazards I can think of? Well, the animals are a hazard. The environment could be a hazard. I love my coworkers, but people have different personalities. People have different tolerances for the sleep deprivation and the work that we do. So we have to think about our own strengths and weaknesses. The equipment can be a hazard, and my favorite category is the one over there on the right, which is the other WTF category. So what are some of the animal exposures to worry about? Well, there's the pigs themselves and the potential pathogens and the parasites, but there are also exposure hazards from us to the pigs, right? Those might be the trauma from our trapping efforts and potentially morbidity or mortality associated with the drugs that we're going to use to immobilize them. So you come up with your categories and you walk through each one of these, developing your list of exposures or hazards and your consequences and your mitigations. And all the time you keep in mind the goals of human, animal, and environmental safety. So some tips to keep in mind: use and review the study protocol as you develop your risk assessment because the two are intertwined. The study protocol provides the framework for the risk assessment, but the risk assessment process often identifies things that may make you rethink something that's in your protocol. Going back to those sticking points I mentioned a few moments ago, there needs to be collaboration and trust between the people planning and doing the study and the institution's biosafety, safety, and ICRA committees. And my observation, having been on both sides, that this can be a funky dynamic, partly for the reasons I previously mentioned, but egos can get in the way as well, and I understand that can be a difficult thing for people to work with. You have to have some trust across the board. You know, you need to trust that the committees are just trying to bring up things that of concern to them about your safety and the animal safety, but they need to trust that you're going to be able to make decisions on the fly in the field when things come up that nobody's thought about that are going to be safe for your people and the animals and the environment as well. And it's a back and forth thing, and it takes time sometimes to build up that trust. So there's several products that can come out of a risk assessment. One of them is a field work plan. You take what you've discovered in the risk assessment process, such as everything you can think of that Mother Nature and the animals and the equipment might throw at you, what duty assignments people are going to have, and the amount of work that will need to be done. And you develop a work plan that outlines things that will help you deal with the problems that are likely to pop up. Another useful product is a field site brief. It's like a mini real-time field risk assessment. I've been on a study that used this, and it was really kind of funny because it was the first time that many of us have encountered this process, and there was a lot of eye rolling when the study director said we were going to be doing this. But as the days went by, more and more people started expressing how they appreciated that we were having these briefs. We met every morning to discuss what was being done that day, by whom, what the potential challenges might be, and we had a safety brief. And in the evening, we got together for a summary of what happened that day, if there were problems, questions, or concerns, what went right, what went wrong, and if we needed to change anything for the next day. And these meetings weren't very long. They were only typically about 10 minutes, but they were very helpful. Another real-time tool is the safety stand-down. Now, if you look up this definition online. There's a zillion definitions, but a real old-fashioned safety stand-down is a process whereby normal work can be paused and the entire site, the entire field crew, focuses on a particular safety issue that's brought up by one of the crew members. Any team member can request it. Everyone respects the request, and the work stops until the concern, the hazard, or whatever is addressed, and you've done your risk assessment on that particular thing, and then you move forward. A risk assessment can help you put together a site-specific fieldwork emergency packet, and that contains not just your standard first aid kit, but a site-specific first aid stuff, such as the SDS information on the chemical immobilization drugs you might be using, because if someone takes a hit of those drugs in the eyes, how likely is it that an ER doc in a human hospital might know what to do when you get there if he's not familiar with those drugs, which he probably won't be? At NWRC, our safety officer supplied us with what we called yellow cards. They're wallet-sized cards that say, I am a wildlife professional working with animals such as wild pigs, deer, et cetera, et cetera. They carry zoonotic diseases such as rabies, brucellosis, blah, blah, blah. And in places where vectors and ticks might be found that carry diseases such as Lyme disease or ehrlichiosis, et cetera, et cetera. So if you develop a mysterious flu-like disease in the field and you have to go to the hospital or seek medical attention, you give that card to the ER doctor or whoever you're seeing so that they just don't think you have the flu and send you home. A field site record is also a risk assessment product. It contains your itinerary, contact information for people working in the field, and a daily check-in and check-out protocol. When you're going to the field and when do you expect to be back each day, and other important stuff like that SBS sheet and the yellow cards. You give this to a local contact, like maybe the guy behind the desk in the hotel you're staying in, who knows that if you don't come back to the hotel at the time that's in the itinerary, he maybe should be sending somebody out to look for you. So you do the initial risk assessment as you're planning to do a study, but there's a final piece of the risk assessment process called the post-mortem review. Some people call these hot washes, which you perform when the field work or the study is done. The crew sits down and discusses what went right and what went wrong, what could be done better, what maybe should or shouldn't be done next time, and that information is recorded and kept for the next iteration of the study and the next risk assessment. So to summarize, risk assessments are very useful for field work because when you use them to look at your study in a systematic, detailed way, you get a wider overall picture of what you're going to be doing, what's good, and where there might be gaps that you didn't think of and might want to address. They increase your preparedness and safety capabilities for yourself, for the animals you're working on, and for the environment. And by carrying them through from one study to the next, they help improve your future work plan. So there's some people I'd like to thank, specifically Kurt Wicotterin and Nathan Snow, Mike Lavelle, Michael Glow, Joe Halseth, Eric Vanetta, Chad Wickham. Those are the guys at the National Wildlife Research Center that I have been privileged to go into the field with for the last 4 years when I've worked with pigs, and who have been awesome in embracing this idea of using risk assessments. I'd also like to thank Colin Rigney, who's my current supervisor, and Dana Cole, who's the assistant director at CEAH, who I work under, for letting me put these presentations together for you. So if anybody has any questions, there'll be contact information available so you can get a hold of me. Thank you very much for letting me do this presentation.